Good afternoon. My name is Debbie Chen, and I'm the Programs Director for OCA Greater Houston. Thank you for joining us here on our 10th day of the festival. And as a friendly reminder, this Q&A is being broadcast live on YouTube and Facebook, so please feel free to ask questions at any time and leave them in the comments section. We will try our best to address them during the interview. Today, it is an honor for us to dive deeper into the documentary Vincent Who, and joining us from California is Curtis Chin.
Everybody.
Hi, Curtis. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to just kind of have like an informal chat with you and not as much of a formal Q&A. This film was completed back in 2009. Do you think that, Asian and Asian Americans today still have the same reaction like when you were first motivated to make this film?
We were talking about this a little bit earlier. I've been shocked at the longevity of the film. A lot of times filmmakers are excited when their film is still being programmed in festivals and still being talked about a decade after its release. But in my case, it's a mixed emotion, more sad that we're still having the same conversations that were around when we were making the film, as well as the same conversation we were having when Vincent was killed. I think it's interesting to sort of look at that long history, not just in the past 30 years, but then connected to the broader history of how Asian Americans have been treated in this country upon our first arrival, as we start to strategize on ways to make things better. But I do think things are better overall. I'm optimistic in that sense, but maybe it's taken a little bit longer, and that the needle hasn't moved as much as I would have liked to when we made the film, but it has moved. So I guess in that sense, it's a good thing.
We've screened this film before at HAAPIFEST, right? And we still feel it's so relevant, and I hope that people take from this film and are motivated to use it as a tool to want to do more community education. And this kind of segs into just the invisibility, I think, right? And that notion of, are we model minorities? Are we the perpetual foreigner? And so one of the projects that we're working on here is pushing for API curriculum studies, K through 12 in schools, right? And I know you've done some other work around, education and the education system here in America. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, obviously, education is a hot topic, always has been, right? And it takes many different forms. I mean, to a large degree, for Asian Americans, one of the most contentious issue of the last decade really has been about affirmative action and standardized testing and admissions into the elite, private schools. That has actually really dominated a lot of the discussion. More recently, the notion of critical race theory and how Asian Americans fit into that discussion is coming to the forefront. And so for me as a filmmaker, but someone without kids, and someone who actually didn't really like school much myself. I mean, I had to do a lot of research and asking around and trying to figure out, what is my, opinion about some of these issues. And I think one of the things that I learned in making another film called Tested, which looked at some of these other issues, and thinking about some of the things that people talk about now, is the long history of how education in America has been racialized, right? From the very, very beginning of who was admitted into the schools, and how a lot of white, people did not want people of color to be educated, or in some weird way, how they wanted them to be educated, where Native Americans were ripped from their families and forced into different education scenarios. And so it's always been racialized. And how Asian Americans fit into this is, I talk about this, when I screen the other film, Tested. When public education was free and open to everybody, that usually meant for white people. But then when African Americans wanted to gain access to this public education, they had to force it, right, to desegregate the schools. And that's how they were able to gain some access to it. But in response, a lot of white families then, moved away or pulled their kids out of particular schools. And at that time, the prevailing attitude was, okay, well, Black kids are in the public schools now. They're just not doing very well. And they blamed it on the Black families, right, for being, broken, having all these other challenges. And so there was no sympathy, for that, for that other community. But then when Asian Americans came along, that sort of changed the debate, because we had to fight for access too, right? Because we were originally kept out of the schools. But then when you had this giant influx, particularly, in the 60s, of Asian American families coming in and more Asian American kids coming to the school system, you suddenly had these Asian Americans that were doing very well, in the public schools. And then there was a backlash against that, where it's the opposite, where it's like, Asian Americans, we work too hard. And so the way I always talk about this is, the stereotypes against Blacks and Latinos about education is that they're lazy and they don't work very hard. And the stereotype about Asian Americans is the exact opposite. It's that we work too hard, that we're robots, that we don't have personalities, right? But the only families that actually know how to raise their kids perfectly are the white families, because they know how to strike that. They know how to strike that balance of, hard work and downtime, right? And so when you
look at the narrative that's pushed, yes,
that's a narrative that's and you have to be careful about how these policies are being, dictated based off of these assumptions and what the end goal is. And the end goal is to, remain control of the system, remain control of what's being taught, and who has access to it. And yes, sometimes Asian Americans get some of the crumbs to it, but to a large degree, there are large segments of our community that don't have access. And also, even if we are able to break these barriers, how much better would we be doing if we didn't have all these additional burdens against us, right? Might we actually have, more kids that are, able to put together a really great portfolio and get into these great schools? So I think those are the deeper questions that we have to ask. And then now, again, as people are pushing back against the issue of critical race theory, we have to ask ourselves as Asian Americans where we fit into it. Because, frankly, there have been a lot of, and I'll call this out, there have been a lot of Chinese Americans who have come out against critical race theory, not understanding how that connects to our own community. And the racism that we felt, and why it's important to talk about the history of racism against our community.
Well, I think that ties back to, Vincent, right? Mm-hmm. And he was attacked for being a foreigner, right? He was attacked and he was murdered essentially for being perceived as being a foreigner and not belonging here, not being an American. And that, I think, goes directly to the fact that we're not reflected in the history books. We're not reflected in education.
But that's what
we're visible.
Yeah, but that's what critical race theory. I'm not an expert in this. I mean, I didn't study it. This is just stuff I've been reading in the news and stuff like that about what critical race theory is. But if critical race theory is just talking about the fact that, when the Europeans came over, they took people's lands, right? Or that, African Americans were primarily slaves, or that the immigration policy in America had racist, undertones or overtones, then yeah, what's wrong with saying that? Because as Asian Americans, we need to know that history because it impacts our own understanding of ourselves. Like when I think about my own family's journey, having come here in the late 1800s, and I think about how, it was only the men that came over because the women weren't allowed to come over. But then eventually how they opened up a Chinese restaurant or they opened up a business because that allowed them to then be able to sponsor their relatives to come over, right? Or how we had some people in our family who we weren't allowed to really talk about because they were paper sons. Do you know what I mean? So like you look at all this whole history, but then you also combine it with the history of America. It's a very fascinating thing that we learn about ourselves, right? Like how did Chinese restaurants become so popular, in this country? And when did that happen?
There are more Chinese restaurants than there are McDonald's. in this country?
McDonald's, KFC, Pizza Hut combined, I mean, there are a lot. But when you think about the history of America, it's a very fascinating thing that they took off in the 40s and 50s at the time when China and America became allies during World War II. Right? And there was a changing attitude so that people weren't as racist. And so they needed to learn about America. But at the same time, coming from Detroit, where, you started to have a middle class thanks to the auto industry and thanks to the war mobilization and women, leaving the family home to help with the war efforts by working in the factories, you started to have, a need for inexpensive dining options outside the family home. And voila, Chinese restaurants fit perfectly into that narrative. And so, not only do we need to learn our own Asian American, Chinese American history to learn about our own families and our journey, but it also helps us with a better understanding of America and America's journey too. So, we need to keep pushing for education because I think that will help us advance some of our political goals, some of our other social, cultural ambitions that we have.
Well, I think it's, a fundamental pillar that upholds racism, right? And it upholds this notion that, Asians are somehow not as American, we're these foreigners, and it's somehow okay, to not just murder, but like to injure or to attack Asian Americans. Like, it's not, I mean, I say this because we're in this climate right now, right? Which is why I think that your film is still so relevant and it's sad the fact that it's still relevant, right? But it reflects the fact that I like to say right now, maybe we're in this movement of awareness, and maybe this will push change. Maybe this will help, people to understand why it's so important that all of our histories are actually taught and made available to prevent this type of, hate. But it's a reflection that it's been here all along, right? It's not like it just suddenly happened. It's been here.
One of the things that I point out about the Vincent Chin case, murder, killing, however you want to label it, is the fact that these two men decided to take a baseball bat and bash in Vincent's head on Woodward Avenue. Woodward Avenue is the main artery in Detroit, right? It is the busiest road. The fact that these two people felt that they could kill him in, it's not like they felt like they had to hide and do it in the back alley. They did it in clear sight with a whole bunch of people sitting around watching. It just showed you, how the power dynamics between the two, where they felt like they could get away with it, and sadly they did get away with it, right? And so maybe those two white killers' assessment of the situation, where they could kill a Chinese American, an Asian American, in public view on the busiest street in Detroit in front of cops, that they would still be protected and set free. I mean, maybe that's probably the biggest indictment of the system.
So I'm going to ask you a question that you hear all the time, right? What motivated you to become a filmmaker, right? It's not a traditional career, and not only are you a filmmaker, but you've been a longtime activist. You're an activist filmmaker, which I think adds another nuance to that. What made you go into this and stick with it?
I've always been seen the connection between creativity and political empowerment. I mean, it's just something that's always struck with me. I'm actually working on a memoir right now called Everything I Learned. I learned in a Chinese restaurant, and it's about growing up in my family's Chinese restaurant in Detroit, being Asian in a black and white city, being gay in a working class immigrant community. And so I've always seen the intersection of all of these issues. And even as I pursued a writing career in college, I was at the University of Michigan. I already knew race was a factor, right, in terms of how my career will be dictated. So I got into this creative writing program, which I think accepted about 20 people. So it's pretty exclusive, but I was the only person of color. And
wow,
the fact that you hear whispers from all the other white kids that didn't get in to the program, some of them who I'd been taking classes with, right? The fact that they thought that I only got in because I was a, person of color and they needed diversity was like, wait, there are 19 other white kids that did get in, and why do you think that? So the only reason I got in was because of the color of my skin, to the fact that, and this is all in the book, but, when I took a fiction writing class and, the instructor told everybody to write from the perspective of a different character so that you can expand your voice. And a lot of the white writers would write as people of color, but say the most racist things. I'd always have to call them out on it. And so my instructor criticized me in saying that talking about race, really impeded the creativity of the other students. Meanwhile, when I turned in my own story, and I didn't want to follow her assignment because I felt like I don't read enough Asian American literature. I'm going to write something just about my own experience. So I wrote something about a kid growing up in Detroit, Chinatown, and I turned it in, and she called me into her office hours, and then I thought she was going to bust me for, not following her assignment, but instead she accused me of plagiarism and said she said, this story is too good to be from an undergraduate. And to me, that was just, the dichotomy between, okay, well, when white students are writing as people of color, you praise them and say, what a great, job you did. But when a person of color writes in their own authentic voice, you think it's suspect. You think there's something inauthentic or stolen or not to be trusted about it. Just to me, really, got me to understand the connection between creativity, race, power, all that stuff. And it's also, a direct result of having grown up with Vincent Chin's murder as something that really, shaped my understanding of the world and how to balance these things. But now getting to your question of how did I decide to make this film? I actually, it sort of came as a surprise. I actually was working as a TV writer at the time here in Hollywood. And sadly, my dad passed away in a car accident back in Detroit, and I had to move back home and take care of things like selling the family restaurant, selling the family home, nursing my mom back to health because she was in the car at the time, and so she had physical therapy stuff. And, at a crossroad in my life thinking, well, do I go back to LA and try getting back on another TV show, or do I do something more meaningful with my life and do something about social justice, things that I cared about, things that my dad, I think, would have been proud of me doing. And so that's when I decided to pursue making Vincent Who. And it really just started as a thought of like, well, what were the things that sort of defined my childhood? In this case, definitely was one of those things, because he was a family friend of ours. My uncle was his best man. I mean,
wow.
There's just, so it's a case that just really, stuck out to me. And I wanted to examine how other people were looking at it back then. And so that's how the film just sort of came about. And thanks to groups like OCA who embraced me, a first-time filmmaker, I got it off the ground. In retrospect, are there things that I would have done different about the film, the ways that I've done it? Yeah. But I think at the heart of it, the story still resonates with people. And that's why people still look at the film. So
what are some upcoming projects that you have?
Well, I mentioned the memoir, which I'm having so much fun writing. I mean, even though I've been doing for a long time, sometimes these things are out of your control. So I started writing this book, everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant, because, I was touring around with my films. I've literally gone to over 500 places around the world in over a dozen countries speaking. And what I was doing in the hotel room before these talks was I was taking notes about what would I say during a Q&A? And at some point I realized, I have a lot of stories here. Maybe I'll write a book. And I originally had structured it as like a Chinese menu. It was just going to be like appetizers, entrees, desserts, and stuff like that. And it was just fun anecdotes about, this crazy family that I have, in Detroit. But I didn't get too much traction. I tried finding agents. I'd get some initial interest in it, but not much further. But then, interestingly, something happened last year during COVID. Well, actually, the George Floyd murder, right? And suddenly, the conversation about race took off in America, and it also made me think about my own book and my own ideas of race growing up, right? Because again, the original concept of the book was going to be family anecdotes, funny jokes, and recipes, right? Like a very, very, whatever. But after that, I've now shifted it. So it's actually a bit more serious. There's still a lot of humor. It's still funny because my family is crazy. So obviously there's going to be humor. But, it also charts, more about race, right? What was it like being Asian in a black and white world? And I think that's something that is very relevant, not just to our community, but to the country, right? How do we make sense of this mosaic that we have, but also the coming out process comes out more, forcefully in this draft, and also the intersection where these issues collide with each other. Like, so for instance, when I was in high school and AIDS was coming up, I was really scared about coming out because all you ever saw about gay people was that they were young and dying. And I really honestly thought that I'd be dead by the age of 30. It just was not a good prognosis to be gay, trying to come out in the 80s. And then one night in our restaurant, this drag queen comes in with her date, and they're just laughing and having a really good times, as drag queens like to do. And for the first time, I thought like, wow, maybe being gay isn't a death sentence. Maybe there is happiness to be found out there. And I guess she must have caught me staring at her a little too much, because as I went to take her order back into the kitchen, she screamed across the dining room floor, "You better not be serving us dog meat." I'm like, it's like, you can't win. It's like, on one hand, you think like you found a friend and an ally, someone who you can connect with, but she obviously had other issues going on. And it's that intersectionality that we as people of color oftentimes have to deal with it, whether it's because of race, sexual orientation, class, religion, gender, or whatever. We're juggling multiple balls. And so I started shifting the focus of the book to talk more about stories like this that weren't originally going to be in the book. And I luckily got offers from a few different agents who wanted to represent the book, like a big turnaround. Like people are now like, oh, I want this book. And so I've been working with I've been working with this agent who I really, really love. I mean, she's Asian American, which I think helps,
Definitely.
And so we've been working on the proposal for about 7 months. Now we've moved on to writing out some of the sample chapters. And so hopefully that book will take off. I'm really excited. That's where I'm putting most of my energy. Another project that might interest some of the viewers here is that, prior to COVID, I had been working on a new documentary called Our Chinatown, which looks at gentrification of the oldest Chinatowns, the original. Like, how hockey has the original 6? I feel like, there's some original 6 Chinatowns too. And I was going to follow them and look at the challenges that they were dealing with, not just overcrowding, not just, an aging population. I mean, all these gentrification,
for sure.
Those are the issues I felt were the issues that our community was dealing with. But then obviously with COVID and the resurgence of xenophobia, right? It totally changed the whole conversation. So I had to stop filming. And so I put that film on hold, unsure what I could do with it, because frankly, the conversation had changed. Some of the topics that we were addressing no longer felt as imperative as these new issues, right? Of hate crimes again. And, sadly, one of the people that we were featuring in our film, Corky Lee, who I'm sure many of these viewers here are familiar with, and I know he was a big part of OCA too. He sadly passed away from the disease in January, and I talked with the people working with us on the film, and we felt like, okay, well, how can we make sure that Corky's story gets out there? Because Corky really opened up to us in the filming, and I think he trusted us because we were like him. We were, like you said, Debbie, we were activists, creators,
Activist artists and creative.
activist artists in the community, and so we had a simpatico like that, and so he really opened up to us in that sense, and so we have this wonderful footage that I think really offers a different side of Corky that people may not be familiar with. And so we're in the process of trying to finish that. Obviously, with independent filmmaking, so much of it's about fundraising. So, cheap plug, if anybody wants to help donate, the post-production of the film. We've edited the film. Now we're just looking to find a composer. We're looking to do color correction. So we're getting close to it, but we do need funds to pay, the crew to finish out. So you can email us at, curtischin8@gmail.com, or go to our website at curtisfromdetroit.com and find out my contact information. So I think that's the next thing that we want to release is, the Corky Lee short, which will be about 15, 20 minutes. And that will be part of a larger series of the other profiles that we did in Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago. Those will also be independently released as shorts and then later compiled as a DVD. And, hopefully we can include Houston in this conversation too.
We really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it. And, again, you say that, you thanked OCA for our support of this, Vincent Hu film. But we really appreciate all the work that you've done over the years and, graciously come and spoken with our members and, the different communities around the country. So I'm really happy that we're able to have that partnership. And when you were speaking about the cookbook, OCA's 50th anniversary is in 2023. It's actually right around the corner.
Oh my God.
We are putting together a cookbook, history / history book, right? So we would love to have you submit a recipe and be a part of that. We want.
Do you have anybody from Detroit submitting?
You would be the first. I'm sure we're going to arm twist Roland or some other people too.
What I think is fascinating about that idea is because you guys have chapters all across the country that you will get regional dishes. Like we have something in Detroit called almond boneless chicken or wasu gai. I don't know where else has it,
I've never heard of it.
It was like every Chinese restaurant in Detroit has wasu gai, almond boneless chicken, Google it if you want, but it's a Detroit original, or the fact that, like our restaurant, we used peanut butter, which is actually something that came out of Chicago because our very first cook that we hired in 1940 actually had been cooking in Chicago, and we hired him to come to Detroit because my family.
Stories like that are part of what we also want to include, right? Because we decided on a cookbook / history is because almost all the people I know in OCA are foodies to some degree, right? And so many community organizing meetings are actually around food. Like you always have to have food in an event, and then people come out and you're sitting there and you're talking about things, you're brainstorming. I just think food is such an integral part of community and activism. So that's why we wanted to include that and put it into a cookbook format and include,
it's a great idea. Yeah, it's a great idea. My cousin actually is a pretty well-known cook. So I'm
definitely going to follow up with you. Maybe he has that recipe for the almond.
No, she's not from Detroit. She actually, a plug to her. She writes a series called Nom Nom Paleo. I think they sell her things at Whole Foods and things like that. But it's a protein thing. But she's based in the Bay Area. But maybe she'll want to contribute something. I'll mention it to her.
That'll be great. Thank you so much. So, if people want to watch your film again, where can they go to view it and to purchase to support your work?
Yeah, thank you for that, Debbie. So from the beginning, I've always made Vincent Hu free of charge for people to watch online because I just felt like that's why I made the film. I mean, it was about letting people know the story. And so I know there's been a bootleg thing on YouTube from the beginning, but it's broken up into different chapters, which might be annoying to people. So if you actually want to watch the full 40-minute film uninterrupted, you can go to my website, Curtis from Detroit, and it'll be available there. It's no password necessary. And feel free to share it with people, because that's what I want. I want people to do it. I do, when I do sessions, like a lot of schools will bring me out, or colleges or corporations or government entities. I do charge for that because I feel like that's my time,
Well, you have to
talk.
eat, right?
Yeah.
And I encourage everyone who watches this, like, if you're bringing in artists to, try and really support artists and creatives. At the end of the day, everybody has to make a living. Everybody has to, this is your career. Right.
Yeah.
So it's your time, but really this is your art and your craft, and it's your career.
Yeah, no, and I've been lucky enough to have people do that. I mean, even during this, lockdown period where, corporations like Nestle, have approached me, or universities have still asked me to come and speak to them. And so it's been good because I love being part of this conversation. Even though these are tough topics, I feel like I try to take my positivity and my creativity to address some of these issues, and that's where I feel like I'm most useful. So, that's what I want to contribute.
So, last question we'll end is, what do you hope that people take from this, right? From your film and going forward, what do you hope that people can do with it?
What do I want people to do with the film? I mean, I think just spreading the word and just viewing it and getting people to appreciate this notion of a unified Asian American community. I think that, if you watch the film, we're pretty strategic, I think, in terms of choosing the people that are in there and having a really diverse collective of speakers talking about different things. And to me, one of the debates that people often ask is there really such thing as an Asian American community? I mean, or are we really just like, is it just a political alliance of different ethnic groups or something? And I've just never thought that way. I've always just thought of it as a genuine, real community. But maybe it's because I had the unique experience of not only growing up, during the Vincent Chin time period in Detroit, where I saw Pan-Asian movements, but because we had such a small community there, the different Asian groups did, associate with each other. So like the Chinatown there, wasn't just Chinese. There were also Filipinos, Indians, Afghanis, growing up in that area. Every year, Detroit, we had a thing called the Far Eastern Food Festival, but it included everybody. You know what I mean? And so I've just always grown up with, Pan-Asian sensibility. And that was important to me for the film, is that, yes, maybe it's not fully accepted at this point by everybody, but I think the more we talk about it, the more we use this term, the more we present visions, it becomes a more natural thing where it does make sense to people, where it doesn't seem like, oh, it's just a strategic thing, but it becomes a genuine, heartfelt thing. Because for me, being Asian American isn't a strategic thing. It is really comes from the heart. It's something that I really emotionally feel connected to, that I really value and feel like it's something that shaped my life. And so, I don't see it as just a strategic thing. I see it as a genuine thing. And I hope that more people see it that way too. So.
Well, Curtis, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come and talk with us. And, personally, I've always found your film to be just inspiring. And I hope everyone who's watched it and who will watch in the future, finds it motivating and inspiring too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everyone, if you'd like to follow Curtis and get updates on his projects, please do go to see curtisfromdetroit.com. Please, donate and support, and share the link. The film is available for free, and we will have this recording available for people to watch as well. But please, do consider getting involved in supporting community organizations and supporting artists and filmmakers. And this concludes our first film block for today, the day 10 of HAAPIFEST Tonight's film block will be Raising Artists. To Be Visible uses the whimsical art of puppetry animation to engage audiences in more serious discussion about Japanese American history. Idol uncovers the cutthroat world of girl groups and the challenges of staying on top while avoiding financial rock bottom. And then Tokyo Hula explores the art of hula dancing and how Japan has both embraced and evolved this traditional Hawaiian dance into a thriving industry. Tickets and passes are still available, so please go to HAAPIFEST21 for more details and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all of our sponsors and supporters.